Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and begin. Thank you so much for joining us for this live office hours for Black Minds Matter. Both myself and Dr. Ford are here to respond to the questions and comments that you have. We'll be using the chat window, well, not the chat window, but the Q&A function rather, to be addressing questions, and then we're just going to spend our time going through them. So thank you all for being here. So the first question says, I am working on my dissertation studying Black male underrepresentation in rural Northwest Alabama community colleges. What is a good source, 2016 and more recent research? Well, there's been a lot of research over the past, gosh, I would say 7 years on Black male students in community colleges. What's really interesting is that when Frank and I started doing our work with the SEAL Center, which is focused on specifically Black men in community colleges, men of color in community colleges more specifically. When we first started engaging in the work, there was only a handful of studies that had ever been published on the topic. And one of the things that we found early on is that there was a lot of programs that were being created, particularly mentoring programs at community colleges that were based upon the four-year college research. You know, well-meaning, well-intended community college leaders would go, that read something that was written very nicely about, you know, Black men at highly selective four-year institutions, and then they would take it to the community college and they would try to apply it, and they would find that, in fact, it wasn't very useful, and it was hard to translate. And that's because we know there's some big differences. You know, we know that, for example, there's an age difference. Average age of a Black male in a community college is 28 to 29 years old nationally. In comparison to their four-year counterparts, they're more likely to be married. They're more likely to be employed full-time. They're more likely to experience stressful life events. So it's categorically different population. In fact, there's a piece that I wrote called "The Same But Different" that does comparisons about Black males in community colleges in comparison to their colleagues, and I definitely recommend that. Also, if you go to our center's website, that's cceal.org, cceal.org, there's a list of publications, and it's essentially a reference list for doing work on men of color in community colleges. So just go there to that website, click on publications, and that would be a series of good sources. If you're looking for good quantitative data sources, not a lot that's going to be able to disaggregate by that specific area that you're looking at. The best you might be able to do is pulling something from national data sets. In particular, NIPSAS might be one if you can get a hold of the data file. That's the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study. They tend to have some decent high-level quantitative data with a large enough sample size to be able to do something with. But you would need to be able to have access to probably the restricted data source rather than that. But if there's other questions about this, please feel free to follow up. This happens to be both myself and Frank's area specialty. Okay, but, yes, Dr. Ford, please.
Yeah, and I also want to add that don't just restrict this to community colleges. Definitely stay, you know, obviously in the context of rural areas. But there's not a lot of work out there about, excuse me, rural Black people, rural Black students. And I and Joy Davis and some others have started to write about that more. So in your literature review, when it comes to the pipeline that Jay Lookwood and I in this series talks about, make sure that you include in your literature review the paucity of research, the paucity of literature on rural Black students, just period. Because if we don't know what the pipeline is, then how do we understand what it is when they get to community colleges in rural communities? Almost everything is about urban Black students. Yeah. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but we must not forget that there are Black students, quite a few in rural communities, depending on what state you're in, depending on what district you're in, etc.
I'm glad you said that, Dr. Ford, because it reminds me of one other thing that would be important to note. And the work that has been done on suspensions, oftentimes when people look, and I know you're looking at community colleges, but oftentimes there's a pipeline view that you might want to be accounted for in your work. One of the things that we find is that the highest suspension rates are in rural areas because there's a much smaller number oftentimes of Black people in those areas, and or the infrastructure for reporting may not be the same because of lack of resources to do so. So there's definitely some other patterns that you want to bring in. So I think Dr. Ford's recommendation is really important. And this next question I think is really for you, Dr. Ford. I'm in an online in a school. I'm in school online and a first generation PhD student. Are you aware of any support groups or networks to help with the adjustment curve?
So
Alley, Dr. Ford.
you are laughing, Luke, because you know exactly what I'm going to say.
Yep.
So in 2013, I created, along with two other people, what's called RACE mentoring. RACE, RACE mentoring. So RACE means research, advocacy, collaboration, empowerment, and that is our support group. We just held a conference, etc. We have subgroups, scholarship, teaching, P to 12. I'm sorry, yeah, P to 12. I was gonna say K to 12, but P to 12, uh, and more. So there are other organizations I'm talking about just social media for now out there, but race mentoring is the one I'm recommending right now as
Absolutely.
a support group.
Okay, next question. We are planning for fall to do a career ed discipline project at our community college that would involve Zoom sessions with hiring managers, recruiters, and many of our career education discipline classes. We would love recommendations for a possible speaker trainer on equity-minded career preparation because we plan to make it the major focus of the training for the faculty members who will be facilitating these career preparation events. Do you have any recommendation on speakers who could specifically focus on equity-minded practices for facilitating career preparation for students?
So I'm jumping in front of you.
Oh no, go for
Uh, Look, I'm being serious and I'm not trying to be sarcastic, but you're looking at two people right here,
it.
Dr. Wood and me, and others who we have presented in this series. Absolutely. So that's the answer right there. It's short and simple. Wood, me, and the speakers in the previous and upcoming series right now.
Absolutely. You had the same response I had. So
That's it.
yeah,
That's it.
yeah. There and in terms of like that specific micro area, if it really needs to be the harder focus on the career component of that, I'd also recommend Dwayne Reed from Year Up, as well as Frank Harris. Both of them have done a lot of work in that area specifically. Um, Now, next question. How should we respond to AAVE in academic writing? I believe it's African American Vernacular English. Are you familiar with the work of April Baker Bell? She argues that forcing Black students to code switch, although often well-intentioned, leads to internalized linguistic racism. If we encourage the use of African American Vernacular English in writing, and not just in narratives, but in research papers, we are setting students up for failure in future courses since most teachers will penalize them for it. This is a question. How can we seriously value African American Vernacular English, challenge the hegemonic influence of white English, AKA Standard American English, and prepare students to succeed in an academic world that is outright hostile to African American Vernacular English?
You want me to take that?
Yeah.
All right. I am 100% in support of Black English, African American English, African American vernacular English, you name it. It is considered a language, not a dialect. And we must take responsibility, and which is difficult, to make sure that our children who speak this language, not a dialect, language, are not penalized for doing so. So it is incumbent upon us to educate our children. There's a book out there by Alim, Alim, and it's about President Obama and people being so stunned that the former president could speak so well. And I hate the term articulate, but the book was called by Aleem. So let me make it clear. I have no problems with this book. I'm advocating for his book. So the book is by Aleem and it's about President Obama and it's called Articulate While Black, and people need to get it. There is no way I think that Obama, could have won the election if he did not speak Black English, AAVE, whatever you want to call it, if he didn't do mainstream, I don't use the word standard. So I take offense to the word standard. I said mainstream because when you say standard, that means something else is unstandard, which means is wrong and inferior, etc. But he also spoke slang, and people often confuse. So we got to get it right. Black English and slang, they're not the same thing. So we must teach our children that when it is in their best interest, meaning a win-win, to speak Black English, African American English vernacular or vernacular English, etc., that when it's in their best interest, do it. And when it's in your best interest to speak mainstream English, do it. And then let's add slang when it's in your best interest. And again, slang is not a language, but I'm just saying like cool pose and some other kinds of things. So I oppose anyone and I would take on anyone who has a problem with teaching our children to cross boundaries and borders in order to be successful. I speak Black English. I speak mainstream. I don't speak slang. That's really not my generation. And I am successful because I know how to do it and I know when to do it and I know why to do it.
Absolutely. Next question says, good morning. I was reflecting on Thursday's conversation that provided transfer track data. I believe that might have been either Dr. Harris or Dr. Zamani Gallagher's presentation. What are the implications and opportunities for community college programs that focus on Black reentry students at 25 plus years old, single parent adults that are typically geared towards workforce preparedness, career technical education, given workforce demands? Now, reentry can mean a couple different things. So I don't know whether you're referring to reentry as in adult returnees or reentry as in those who've been formerly incarcerated. That would be a clarification that would definitely need. But what are the implications of opportunities for community college programs that focus on this? I think that there's a lot of opportunity for programs that focus on this. And I do think that we need to ensure that we're providing students with an opportunity to be able to go into our colleges and have the types of meaningful experiences that other students do. We oftentimes find that in community colleges that internship opportunities, fellowship opportunities, externships, apprenticeships, that while even you might find that Black students are in programs that are CTE programs that are dedicated to providing those kind of opportunities to all students, that they do not get as many opportunities as other students. And what we often find is that they're in jobs that are categorically different than their peers. First, they're in jobs that are physically demanding. So while their other college peers are in programs that allow them to have again, internships and externships because of institutionalized racism and racism in general, they don't have that. So they're working security instead. They're moving boxes, digging ditches, stocking shelves, doing construction site cleanup. So We know that first, they're in jobs that are instead physically demanding. Second, they're in jobs that occur late at night. So they oftentimes either work the late night shift or the overnight shift, getting off work 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning with their first class at what time? 8 a.m. And then the third piece is that they're oftentimes in jobs that are temporary or transitory in nature. So one job for a period of time out of that job, and another job for a period of time out of that job. So they're going through constant transitions externally while they're trying to transition and be successful internally. So ultimately, what we want to do is make sure that they're having access to those opportunities. Now, one of the things that I have been very concerned with is a pattern that I've seen in community colleges where, particularly with academic advisors and counselors that do academic advising and career advising, is that is not uncommon to find a Black student being tracked into a field based upon a perception that they are inherently less capable. So, and I talked about this before, what happens when people outperform low expectations, right? So one example of this would be that you have a student who goes in, they sit down with a counselor, they say, I want to do X, and the counselor counsels them to instead do something that is more CTE focused because they think, well, this will help them get a job. They're not really, they didn't really do good in high school, so maybe it'd be better if we just put them into CTE fields. And so CTE fields are wonderful, of course, but we also don't want to make sure that we don't have a situation where people are being tracked into it simply because of the color of their skin. I think the perfect example of this is when my colleague Frank and I, we were at a college somewhere, I'm not going to say what state, and we were doing a presentation. We had met in the morning with counselors, we met in the afternoon with instructional faculty, talking to them about how we can best support men of color as they're transitioning into and out of our community colleges. And then one thing that happened was interesting is that as we were getting ready to leave, there was an executive administrator who said, hey, we have a group of Black and Latino men coming in here. They're transitioning from high school. And, would it be fine if you all could just spend a couple minutes talking to them? So Frank and I were, of course, we'd love to talk to them. So we stay behind. This room fills of Black and Latino males, high school guys who are looking to transition into the community college. And the person who asked us to stay gets up there and starts out by saying, some of you might be saying to yourselves that I want to be a doctor. And some of you might be saying to yourselves, I want to be a lawyer. But have you ever thought about auto tech? Have you ever thought about being a chef? And Frank and I looked at each other like, huh? Did that just happen? But then it was like, okay, well, maybe what she's trying to say is to open up your mind, look at all the wonderful opportunities we have here. So I didn't feel right, didn't sit right, but then I was like, okay, well, maybe that's what the intent was. Then a minute or two later, into this short introduction of myself and Frank, she says again, some of you might be saying to yourselves that I want to be a doctor or that I want to be a lawyer. Have you ever thought about auto tech? Have you ever thought about being a chef? And then in the midst of a very short introduction, she said it a third time. And what it was is that she had this perception of these students that they were going to be unable to be successful. So the idea was to track them into fields and areas that she thought, based upon her experience, would be, even if they had no relationship to what the students wanted to do. And so we can also see this quantitatively. We've done several analyses of both our data and data that has been shared with us from partner shops, research shops. And one of the things that we have found is that it is not uncommon for that when we look at it quantitatively, that somebody who meets with an academic advisor when they're Black and they have aspirations to earn an associate's degree or transfer, that it's significantly more likely that if they meet with an academic advisor, that they will choose a certificate path instead. Right. And so we have to recognize that those things are taking place. So yes, there's absolutely space for programs like this. They're absolutely critical, absolutely needed. And those are just some of the reasons why.
So, Luke, and to the person who asked a question, now you have me both reflecting on my experiences. And if I listen to my high school advisor, if I listen to one of my undergraduate advisors, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. So yes, there's a place, but tracking starts early. And young children, so tracking starts usually around what, middle school, eighth grade. And that is not the time to be asking or placing our children, which again is this pipeline in programs that and experiences that they didn't even know about. So yeah, somebody looks at your skin color, they look at whether you're male or female, meaning black male or female. They look at your height and your weight. They look at whether they're afraid of you. They look at how intimidating you are. They look at other kinds of things, and then they start tracking you. And our children cannot get off that train. And that's what I want you to think about in terms of tracking. Tracking is like a train. You on this train, you on that train, and can you get off? And once you're placed on a non-vocational track, no, I'm sorry, yeah, yeah, a non-academic track. That's what I meant to say. You can't get off of it, and you can't get on a college prep track, and that starts early and without our children's input, and they're not ready for our input. They're eighth graders, and then you can go to the high school piece that you're talking about, Luke. Dr. Wood, the choice is taken out of our children's hands, and that is inequitable. So let me stop.
It's a great point. Next question says, I'm in student services at a technical college in the Pacific Northwest. Our students' demographic reflects our country's demographics. And actually, we have a higher percentage of Black, Indigenous people of color that students than our country, which is great. But what is the most important work we can do to recruit and retain more BIPOC? Thank you. I can start out with this, and then Dr. Ford, I know, would have a response as well. I would say the number one thing that you can focus on is better preparing faculty members to engage populations that many of them never thought they would be engaging. So part of this involves ensuring that we're diversifying the faculty, staff, and administrative force so that students have the opportunity to engage in classes with individuals who can be reflective of them and their communities. But another part of it is recognizing that there's already faculty there and that many of them are in desperate need of enhanced professional learning and development. One of the things that differs between K-12 and higher ed is that there's a difference in the terms of training and preparation. To be a K-12 educator, you go to a college, you earn your credential or certification, and you have a preparation that basically says you're ready to go and teach. Now, we can argue whether or not individuals are ready to go and teach diverse students, right? But there has been at least some basic training in pedagogy, instruction, learning. Now, what we see in community colleges and four-year universities is actually a very different pattern. People have oftentimes no certification, so they go straight into the classroom. So your average community college instructor, let's say in biology, has a bachelor's degree in biology, worked in industry for a couple of years, has a master's degree in biology, and then they go straight into the classroom. And then so what do they do in terms of teaching? Well, they think about the individuals who they've seen teach them. And so what they do is they oftentimes teach how they were taught. And how they are taught is typically not how our students of color learn. And the reason for that is that because of the ways that individuals have been prepared, they've been prepared with a Eurocentric curriculum, through Eurocentric teaching styles, through oftentimes a stand and deliver approach that is just not good instruction. And so people replicate that, and then it continues to manifest as problems. So we believe that you have to go in and prepare people to engage and teach, right, as the baseline, but then recognizing that teaching, you can learn how to teach students in general, but being effective in teaching minoritized students is is a higher calling, and it requires more work, right? It requires more work because it's not because I would say that it is necessarily harder, but because it's different. It's more relationship based. It's about focusing on your perceptions and stereotypes that you might have. It's learning about strategies and practices. It's understanding holistically what students are going through, and then thinking about how you can better support them in their development. So because of that, we oftentimes find that there's major challenges in our community colleges and in our universities because people were simply not trained how to teach, and even more so, not trained how to teach students from diverse backgrounds. The other thing I would say is no work will ever be done in advancing success outcomes for students if you don't have your campus leadership on board. Since you're at a community college, I would argue that the campus leadership is going to be your vice president of instruction, your president, your faculty, senate president, and at least one trustee. If you don't have those four people on the same page saying that equity is important, we're going to advance student success, we're committed to students and what we're doing, then ultimately what you're going to find is that that's a campus that will not have the same level of success. You might have pocketed success. You might have really good program in science or in English. You might have a really good student service area over here, but holistically, your campus will not be set up to create a system and structure that supports students who are BIPOC students.
So before we get to the next question, Dr. Wood, let me say this, and it just expands, it expands on what you said. We are talking about making sure that our students fit, so so relationships matter, and you said that. We also want to make sure that our students are feeling that what they're learning, whatever you're teaching, is hands-on. We want to make sure that what we're being taught is relevant. It means something to us. We can identify with this. We want to make sure that it is also relevant in terms of, damn, can we use it? I mean, I tell the story of being in calculus, and I'm asking this professor, why am I learning calculus? And he says, for differential equation. What, that don't mean shit to me. I don't even understand calculus. And so now you're talking about differential equations. So we want to make sure that we can use it. We want to make sure that we can have an impact and make a difference. There are so many ways that are not colorblind / culture blind that must be considered. Whether we are talking about a preschooler, an elementary school student, middle school, high school, community college, whatever, four-year college, etc. There are just certain ways that must be used and adopted in terms of how to teach. And Dr. Wood just explained some of those, but I'm saying there are also more that we must consider. So, one would be, what are the instructional strategies? And then the other would be, what other material / curricular strategies and input? So it's a combination of at least those two, and of course, more, which considers who is that student. But as Dr. Wood just said, unfortunately, or I'm sorry, I think I heard you say, unfortunately, at too many colleges and universities, you will not see students getting this information because the majority of professors are white and they don't know, which is why we have Black Minds Matter to help you understand how to do this.
Absolutely. Next question says, and this might be good for you, Dr. Ford, to take first. Will virtual learning help or hurt BIPOC high school students? If they're given devices and hotspots, if it's a hurt, is there a way to mitigate this?
Inequities are going to always exist by race and by income. But as long as we give every child that instrument and then make sure that they have access to internet. And then it's up to us to make sure that the content is there for our students. So think about summer loss. Some low income families, families who live in poverty, have a hard time. They have a hell of a time trying to, this before COVID, just have a hard time just finding, just paying for their children to participate in programs. And then some of them or us don't know how to find programs. And now you add COVID to this damn thing, um, inequities. Now you add COVID, and it's a double whammy. So we have to just be diligent and search even harder to see what we can do for our students. So I'm sorry. I was so into that. I think I lost the gist. Dr. Wood, Luke, I'm sorry. I lost the gist
I
of
think,
that last comment.
yeah, basically it's about, and I think you were addressing it. Will virtual learning help or hurt Black, Indigenous people, of color students? And if they're given devices and remove other
Oh,
barriers.
there you go. I well, okay. So I answered the second part, but the first part is, will virtual learning hurt? Answers yes. It'll hurt our Black children and brown children, especially if they live in poverty. But even if they don't, it's still going to hurt for different reasons.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's so important as we do more and more virtual learning to recognize that the main ways that students are engaging us now are through this environment, right? So they see
Mhm.
primarily us on Zoom, and they see our websites, right? Whether it's high school, community college, a little bit different in K-12 and in earlier grades. So I think it becomes even more important than before for us to engage cultural relevance, because there's already a sense of removal from the environment, as all things Dr. Ford was saying, right? People are stressed, right? We've got COVID going on. We know that bias is at an all-time high, because we know that implicit bias manifests when there's three conditions in place. There's incomplete information, people's time is constrained, and they're experiencing stress. Those are the conditions that exemplify what's taking place right now during COVID. So we have students who are having challenges with access to technology, dealing with issues of food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, families that and themselves may be dealing
The
with.
$600 unemployment gone, weekly gone,
Yeah. So you
and
put all
more.
that together, right? And ultimately, what we have to recognize is that we have to be far more intrusive than we ever were before. We have to be far more responsive than ever before. We have to be culturally relevant. We have to focus on building community. We have to be using data to really inform the decisions that we're making. So I would strongly recommend on this the web the YouTube site that we've been using for the class. There's a webinar that was done earlier this summer on equity-minded teaching in the online environment. There might be some pieces in there that can also be helpful for the work that you're doing.
And I want to say this: it's damn okay to be angry, because I'm angry, and it's okay to be frustrated. And but Black minds, I'm sorry, yeah, Black minds matter. We are trying to give you some resources. We may not give you all the resources, but based on whatever questions you ask and the short time frame that we have to answer them, we're giving you, resources. But this is the worst time that I can ever think of. And I'm not even going to talk about social history, but also educational, and especially for children with limited means. And too often they are Black, not all the time, but too often they are Black. So we've got to have culturally responsive education, and we've got to have culturally responsive policies to address inequities, to advocate for students. And as an individual educator, just start with what's in your own classroom. I mean, like, what can you do to make, let's say, I'm use you, Luke. If Luke were in your classroom as a 6-year-old, what could you do to make him feel okay? What could you do to make me feel welcome in your classroom? Luke just talked about relationships. What are you going to do to build those relationships? And not just with us as educators, but those families, so we can move forward. And families want your support, not just want, we need your support.
Absolutely. And Rosemary just shared a resource that I'm going to put in the chat window, just reshare it, from USC on equity minded online teaching as well. Okay, so next question is, in our K-12 school district, we have started unified Black parents, staff, and BSU orgs towards beginning a struggle for equity. We want to document our process. Any advice regarding research and or publicized strategies for community-based organizing to establish equity in a K-12 environment?
Well, I don't see how that differs from what we already said.
I think what this question's trying to get at is, maybe like collective action approaches. Like, what are the different ways of both collecting data and advocacy? So maybe participatory action research might be a good framework for them. But ultimately, it sounds like it's an important effort. I don't have an approach that I would offer per se.
Right.
But what I would say is that, in my experience, what you want to do is to bring parents together, a group of Black parents, large group, and then ask the school leaders to come in and sit down, and then to not say anything, but just to listen to their stories. And then you have the parents go one by one and talk about their stories. And then after that's done, you ask the school for any data that they have on referrals, restrictions from recess, suspensions, expulsions, being barred from extracurricular activities, whatever they have. And you want them to collect that data on a monthly basis to show the representation of Black students in the school and the representation of Black students receiving those different exclusions. Then what you want to do is each month meet with them. Here's how schools and colleges and universities get away from doing anything. When they get away from doing anything, it's oftentimes because the pressure has gone away. Administrators are very responsive to what is the hot issue at the moment. And so if they believe that you're going to raise this as an issue and then you're going to go away, then ultimately, guess what? The success of the effort will go away too, because they will not be as invested. But if they think that no matter what, every month I got to go sit down with these parents and explain this data, then it's going to be a very different process. So I would definitely think about using maybe participatory action research as a framework for it. I definitely believe in critical race counter storytelling. If you look up the work of Daniel Salazano and other scholars, that tends to be a really strong framework for these types of works.
Now, I also want to add that, don't, I'm sorry, I just got distracted looking at the chat box. I'm sorry. So don't just, stop there. Do the research that Dr. Wood just said, but also consider, because I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm just distracted. I'm trying to look for it. But anyway, when you talk about publishing, then keep in mind that you have to go with too often. And unfortunately, the journals dedicated to people of color.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm going to say that that's
I want to say something about that, Dr. Wood.
well, because we were talking about earlier about the difference in the amount of research that's been done on rural Black people. That's mostly because there's no journals that really
There
focus
you
in
go.
that area. So then it ends up being that you have to then send it to a black journal where oftentimes there's maybe not the level of expertise as it relates specifically to the rural experience. And then if you try to send it to a rural journal, they're not going to understand it at all because they
Right.
oftentimes don't have any pieces that deal with race in them. So it's interesting how that also then serves to shape what we see in the field. All right, next question. At our college, we have worked through summer focusing on adopting the 10-point plan to address anti-Blackness that's offered by Lasana Hotep, Frank Harris, and myself. How do you best seek students and employees' voices? So as part of that framework, it was suggested that you have to go and have intentional conversations and elicit the voices of those who are from and experiencing anti-Blackness. So I would say focus groups. You sit down with groups of people and you have some guiding questions about their experience. I would break them up, students, faculty, staff, and keep it separate. If it's a university, I would separate out undergraduates from graduate students and collect data like that. At our institution, we've done the same thing, but what we did was first begin by having conversations on what are microaggressions, what do they look like, how do they manifest, and then use that as a framework to then talk about that conversation. I think in addition to that, you should also consider doing some survey work. If there's some basic measures around climate, around well-being, around belonging that you can collect as well. I oftentimes find that you have to have quantitative data and qualitative data because if you have qualitative data and no quant, people will say, what about the numbers? If you have quantitative data and no qual, people will say, what about the stories and experiences? But ultimately, even if you have both, people are still going to question your work. So you better have both of them ready to go for the arguments that people are going to make against it. But I think those are a couple of ways to collect data. Dr. Ford, anything you'd add to that in terms of data collection?
Yeah. I want to add that also break that information down, not just by undergraduate and graduate, disaggregate that information by race, and also disaggregate that data by gender. So definitely gets to intersectionality. But if anyway, try to do it intersectionally, but we must do it by gender, we must do it by race, we must do it by whether they're at colleges, 2-year institutions or universities, etc., and more. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, and that will make it richer. That will make it more compelling, and that will have more influence.
Absolutely. All right, it says, thank you. I think at a community college, sometimes the struggle is balancing government mandates such as CalWORKs, formerly incarcerated job attainment within 6 months. And I feel like at times we track because we want to hit the metric. I totally agree. And that's an example of how structural discrimination manifests. So thank you for pointing that out. Then he said, thanks. Are you aware of any competency-based education and Black 4-year student completion rates? Could this be a strategy for be promising considering that the objectives are outlined? Dr. Ford, are you aware of anything that deals with competency-based education and Black 4-year student completion rates?
Well, not necessarily competency-based education, but there are reports out there about community colleges rates versus 4-year institutions and those kinds of things. So I tend to rely on, and I said tend to rely on Journal of Black Issues in Higher Education, and also Diverse Issues provides that information. So the data is there, the information is out there. Believe me, you just have to search. And I've seen it, but I don't want to try to quote anything that I recollect about this.
Yeah.
So you got to do your homework. I know that we are here and we're talking about office hours, but it's not on the two of us to just provide this information. What I would like is if you could find it and then ask us to clarify what you found. That would be more helpful as a use of this time on Sunday and the next Sunday and the next Sunday than this. So the person who asked that, I hope you're not offended by it, but I'm saying we need to stop asking questions that the information is already out there.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is that when we look at what are the factors that influence four-year graduation completion rates, competency-based education certainly a factor, but I think that there are other factors that probably would demonstrate a higher degree of predictability. If if I'm thinking in the context of a regression model, competency-based education is not going to be one of my strongest standardized beta coefficients. It's probably going to be a diversity. It's probably going to be issues around sense of belonging. It's going to be around high expectations within the environment. It's going to be around factors more like that. That's not to say that competency based isn't important, because it certainly is. But on the whole, on par, it's going to be issues that deal primarily with perceptions and relationships, because that ultimately we find has more of an effect on the pedagogical practice than anything else.
Two, third thing. So you said perceptions, Luke,
Mm-hmm.
and then relationships, and then the fourth one would be cultural factors
Yeah.
that we bring to the educational setting.
Okay, we're on the last two questions for today. So the first one says, do you believe we need a collective effort to produce a behavioral intervention targeting Black males nationwide? I'm working on a dissertation on Black males in community colleges. I'm in my IRB process. Congratulations. The focus is on identifying values to manifest personal responsibility, and personal power. It is a values-based intervention that addresses environment, post-traumatic stress, and how this stress creates avoidance behavior that disconnects Black males from their support resources. I reference many of your works in my lit review. The objective is to increase the value of Black leadership by helping Black males create help-seeking behavior. Therefore, Black professionals can become a more effective resource. This sounds like a very interesting study, and you're looking at a lot of interesting concepts. One thing that I would definitely encourage you to think about is making sure that we're not setting up a situation where we're focusing on what the student is doing, what the student is bringing, the student's dispositions, because oftentimes that tilts us into the areas of grit, of growth mindset, of other topics that honestly I think have done more damage than good when it comes to looking at and understanding the experience of Black students. So I might almost flip the angle a little bit and look at who are the actors within the institution that are providing these messages of encouragement, that are providing guidance. To what extent are they reaching Black students? To what extent are they following up with them in comparison to their peers? And so I would be looking more so from that same topical area, but from the vantage point of the institution. What are we doing or not doing that's facilitating these different challenges that you're seeing, as opposed to focusing on are the students able to learn how to engage in help seeking? Are the students able to learn how to engage in other factors that are important for their success? So think about how you can embed, I would say, an equity-minded frame into that study. Of course, I'm looking at a very short description, so I'm sure that it may be there. But if not, you really want to make sure that angle ends up being one where it holds the institution and its actors accountable, rather than shifting slowly the perceived blame to students, their families, and their communities.
And that last statement captures it all for me. We must not put the burden, the onus on our students, our children, whatever the age, and I'm including college age students, to do this work. So I'm still looking at that one email. No, I'm looking at the wrong. Something shifted. So I'm sorry. But the bottom line is, as as Luke said, excuse me, the responsibility is on adults. The responsibility, excuse me, is on professionals. The burden should not be on students in any regard in terms of um, the experiences they have. So, oh man, I've lost the
Well, it's
thread.
okay. We can go to the next one. It says, I'm grateful
Okay.
that Dr. Frank Harris mentioned Black masculinity. This topic is a center focus that affects Black men
Yeah.
from achieving their full potential to become human. I've done some research on this topic. There are great authors such as Bell Hooks, We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity, Herman Gray, Black Masculinity and Visual Culture,
Yeah.
Gold, We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity, Thomas Foster, The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under Slavery. I believe this should be more research on this subject. Your thoughts? So I would actually say
Oh
there's
yeah.
a ton of research on
And
this.
more.
Yeah, there's a ton of research on this. Frank Harris, I mean, that's one of the reasons we brought him in. His whole area of specialty and focus. If you go to cceal.org, that's sil.org, you're going to find a ton of different studies that have been done looking at masculinity from very specific perspectives. His work focusing on help seeking. To what degree are some men apprehensive to seek out help because they are worried that they'll be perceived as weak or inferior? Competitive ethos among men, breadwinner orientation. To what extent do men perceive that it is their responsibility to be providers, and in comparison to having a more equitable perspective on breadwinning, and how does that influence their success in college? And then school as a feminine domain, recognizing that many of our schools, the vast majority of K-12 teachers are white and female. So we know that by fourth, fifth grade, that disassociation begins happening in our schools. And I said last time, disassociation is really just another word for saying theft, because ultimately something has been stolen, and that's child's passion for learning. But ultimately, I definitely recommend going to that website to get resources. And then our last question for the
I'm
day.
sorry. I gotta say this, Luke.
Oh yeah.
And it's only I never felt this way until these questions today. So I really appreciate the focus on 2-year colleges. Now, I'm not going to say versus, but 2-year colleges and then 4. But those of us, those of you, because I'm not there, I'm sorry. So those of you who are at 2-year colleges and who are advocating for students at 2-year colleges, in this thread, you see like problematic, apologetic, not unapologetic, but apologetic. You are just as deserving as everything that entails higher education as a 4-year college, a college, HBCU, etc. So we got a lot of dynamics going on here. But the bottom line is publish, publish, publish. Believe in what you do, and then get advocates to help support you. So there are a lot of college questions on 2-year colleges, and it just should have been on like higher ed, in my opinion. Although I know there are differences.
So here's the last question, and Dr. Ford, I'll pass this to you. It says, do you have any advice on the best way to approach doctoral research on underrepresented Black males in rural community colleges? And I think that you can even think about this just as on Black males in general. It says, I don't want to have ill feelings from community college administrators by addressing what they're not doing,
Mm-hmm.
nor do I want to offend Black males or current students.
I've only been at a rural university once, and that was uh, University of Kentucky. And the best thing and I cannot say this enough, the best thing that chancellor who you know, holds the title of president or provost or whatever did was to take all employees on a 3-day tour of Kentucky. Now, as someone who grew up in Cleveland, very urban, East Cleveland, very urban, I had no clue what rural life was. But that 3-day tour was the best thing that that I had experienced to introduce me to rural life way back when. I'm talking about in the 90s, and I'm serious, Luke, even to this day, even to this day. So it would be great if administrators and professors, rural, urban, suburban, etc. Would you may not have 3 days, but can you at least take us on a tour? And I don't mean I mean on a serious tour, so that educators could get it an in-depth understanding of what life is really like across these three different contexts. So anyway, it's just very different. And you may not be able to do 3 days where you could stay at a hotel and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But um, even in your classes, and I'm going to do this in mine, and I've been doing this in mine, I'm going to make sure that you get out of the ivory tower and that you get into the real world so you can make a difference.
And I think that should be our concluding note for the day. Well said by my colleague, Dr. Ford. We just want to thank everyone for coming today, and see you next Sunday.
Next Sunday, Black Minds Matter.